little bit of an emotional and of course professional roller coaster. So I'll take you through a journey of my work, both from the past, present, and also looking into the future. I hope that at least by the end of my presentation, you'll get to know me in a much better way. Okay, so this really is my life story. I worked in the private sector for 15 years plus, majorly in the financial services, some of the top financial services in Africa. And that's where a lot of my work on leadership from an experience perspective came into place. But for the last 20 years, I've also been involved a lot in what I would call grassroots politics, as a community leader, as a chair of various community initiatives that drives policy engagements at grassroots levels. And I think that's where my passion in public policy came into place, and to see what else can I do at a national level to drive possibly the agenda the gaps that I'm seeing within my country and of course within Africa in general. So for the last 5 years, I've been so much engaged in various capacity building initiatives, especially looking at working with legislatures, the young legislatures in Kenya, touching on various aspects of leadership and governance. I've also been involved at a continental level in capacity building of public sector leaders, senior public sector leaders in various programs. So that really then comes holistically what my life is about. But I've also been involved in academia. The last 5 years I've also been teaching as part of my PhD process, which I finalized. So these then comes, of course, right now over the last 5 years also I run a consultancy organization that then drives leadership engagements through teaching, through research, and through coaching. So this is who I am, and I'll talk about the future in a short while. So looking at that background, and if you look at some of my past work on Google Scholar, you will see a lot of my work have been around collaborative leadership, especially trying to address the problem of the functional relationships within organizations that affect performance. And the output out of that, and especially from the research that I've done, there are 3 things that come out as possible way forward in terms of addressing those aspects of the functional relationship. And one is, if you're able to create spaces of authentic relationships where there's mutual trust, mutual understanding, and mutual respect, if you're able to have leaders who have effective behavior, especially in terms of inclusiveness, empowerment, and open communication. From an organization perspective, if the top executives create an environment that fosters collaboration through strategy, through operational guidelines, and really the structure around it, then somehow the very functional relationships in organizations can improve, but then will result in improved performance. And I've done a lot of work around that. So, but reflecting on it, and one of my areas for further research was to look at it from a government perspective. And I look at mostly from an African perspective, and looking at it, the similarities around the government structure, where we have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And some of the issues that have been happening in various African countries around following the rule of law, issues around security, issues around peace. So that got me reflecting and saying, is it something that I can look at it from a collaborative leadership and seeing how that affects governments in terms of the functional nature of the relationship within these 3 structures of government? Would it be a solution to good governance that you're looking at from an African perspective? Looking at it in terms of saying, if political leaders can create an environment of authentic relationships, their behavior is inclusive, they empower each other within those structures, and they have open communication, and of course political goodwill from our sponsor support, could it be a solution to the issue that we face in many African countries? And that's where the aspect of responsible leadership, responsible politics, and responsible citizenship came into place as areas that I So out of that, just really to maybe just focus on this. So that's when we look at responsible leadership, it's a broad concept. But I think for me it was to deep dive, especially in my work here, to look at it specifically from responsible leadership entails the intra-government collaborations and negotiations that happen in the three arms of government. And that's what I took time to unpack, looking at various contexts, both at continental level and of course at national level. Kenya, where I come from, responsible politics. This is where now issues around legal and institutional frameworks that needs to be entrenched in the different constitutional frameworks of different countries, and then we support that. And of course, responsible citizenship that provides civic awareness, civic engagement, and accountability to the political leadership within the different countries in Africa, and possibly that will address the issues that we see within African countries. So as part of the outputs, I said one of my key focus was really to look at, can we rethink good governance in Africa? And good governance has been widely studied in various forms and various ways. So one of my critical outputs was to do a systematic review study that I unpacked almost over 144 articles, and I ended up with 70 articles and then helped to unpack what are these antecedents of good governance that we talk about from an African perspective. What are the mediators and moderators? And what is the outcome? When we talk about good governance, what's this outcome that is important? So when we understand that framework, then it will now seek to enable the local governments in different countries to understand what is this thing that is called intra-government collaboration. What's the focus around it? Because the focus around it is to ensure that it creates spaces of decentralization, providing effective checks and balances, and of course coordinations between the three arms of government to look at the critical national agenda. When you talk about responsible negotiation, which has been widely studied, and Elaine talks about it a lot of times, especially from a humanitarian perspective. So I reflected it from a government perspective, and I look at it in terms of the inclusivity aspect that will then address issues around equitable negotiations, allocation of resources, and of course the partnership that we talk about. And why this was important, because there's been a lot of conversation in the last 5 years in Africa around intra-Africa discussions, sustainability, and all these things around intra-Africa trade and so on. So these could be avenues where we can't talk about intra-Africa if we don't talk about intra-governments within the local government spaces. So it was interesting to unpack how intra-government collaboration and responsible negotiations is actually can play a strategic role in addressing some of the good governance gaps. Of course, these are some of the authors that talked about it from a local perspective. Media is one of the leading online media outlets in Kenya that drives research-based arguments that addresses policy issues. And of course, I've also written a lot within the EUI space, both from the government perspective, and also now looking at it from private public sector engagement that drives the same aspect of collaborative governance. Out of this, there's been some interest around my research. I think I had an interview last year in November, just unpacking the aspect of rethinking good governance in Africa. The last 2 weeks also I had an interview with another think tank here in Italy that I was unpacking now my research around rethinking good governance in Africa, especially in environmental and responsible administration. So these are still conversations that are ongoing. There are concepts that I would want to unpack them more, especially from my country's perspective, and also looking at it from a continental perspective. But I don't want to talk much about the recommendations, because the policy recommendations for me are more ongoing engagements, because it's a concept that is still being unpacked. I would want to have more conversations at local levels, and of course within the countries that I'm engaged with in Africa, especially in terms of testing it out, having discussions, maybe creating some kind of workshops and programs that will help unpack that aspect, that then will lead into something that is practical, that can be implemented at local and of course continental level. But I want to also take this time to really look beyond, policy. Some of the gains for me, as I say, is looking at all our areas here. The central, the focal point of all our areas is leadership and governance. So all of you somehow, we have something that we can unpack with you from a leadership and governance perspective, because it's a central aspect, especially within our local spaces. But I've also had some connections here with, of course, various professors, Professor Ken, Professor Claudio, Lane, Henry, and now Callisto, and Callisto also connected me further to a few other colleagues that we can advance conversations around, good governance that touches on various aspects of it. I've also collaborated with Professor Ken in an article, and one of them is actually one of the latest articles we just shared this morning to EU ideas that touches on state and small business relationships. We've done an article that will be published hopefully this week with Christina and Valentina. We've done a policy paper with Saleh, and of course, I'm looking forward to engaging much more. There's quite a number of projects that are coming up for me, especially in terms of unpacking this aspect of collaborative leadership and governance. So I launched a book initiative that possibly will be out in 2026 as one of my books. One of my, I think I have 3 leadership books. One of them is here. I covered it. So from a practice perspective, and of course lifelong connections with everyone, including master students and so on. So what's next for me? And as I finish is, in my time here, I also registered a think tank, more of a research consulting, and then will advance this agenda. For me, it is critical because I'm more focused into the practice aspect of it rather than the theoretical angle of it. So I want to test it out in terms of practice, in terms of dialogue, workshops, and so on. So the think tank is really to advance that, and many other conversations around that. Definitely from a private sector perspective, which I'm involved in, my consulting company will still progress in terms of capacity building on those various initiatives. I want to be involved in politics of the country now at national level, especially for me in our 2027 election that is coming up in Kenya. Not from a frontline aspirant, but also playing a critical role in policy engagements, policy alignments, and manifesto development, especially for credible political leaders that I want to support. And of course, in academia, I can't run away from it because I'm part of it too. So definitely, it's one of the things that I would get myself involved in more. One of my alma mater university has already engaged me to advance this aspect of African leadership and governance as one of their directors for Center of Africa Studies that will start in September. And of course, I look forward to connecting more here as an alumni, coming back in various initiatives to share my story, to share the journey around some of the things I'm working in the specific area of focus. So I think that's what I wanted to share with you in a nutshell, and I hope then it gives a holistic picture of my past to